How's it going, everybody? It's Tactard Ted. You haven't heard from me for a while. No, I got busy and life got busy. So here we are. We've got the holiday behind us, Christmas. We got my birthday behind us. And now it's time to talk about the world. So yes, there's been a lot of interesting things going on in Ukraine the last few weeks. Interestingly enough, none of it seems to be making its way into the Western media. But the worm has turned, so to speak, for the Ukrainians. There are no great offenses. There are no great gains by the Ukrainian army. In fact, the Ukrainian army seems to be pretty much on the defensive everywhere. In fact, the Russians are now starting to make moves in Kupiansk up north and starting to retake some of the territory that they had lost earlier on. There's a lot of fighting back and forth the last couple days around Kupiansk. The Ukrainians keep pushing in and keep getting smacked back, so we'll see how that goes. Bakhmut is preparing to fall sometime within the next few weeks. They're putting extreme pressure on that nut, and the Ukrainians keep obliging Putin's aims of demilitarization by putting as many fresh reserves into Bakhmut as possible, giving more targets for the Wagner mercenaries and the Russian army to destroy. Also, one of the more interesting developments in the last couple of days has been the proficiency and renewed vigor by which Russians are using counter battery fire to decimate the Ukrainian artillery positions. They seem to be taking out artillery units every single day. In fact, it's got so bad for the Ukrainians that they just don't have the time to kill civilians with artillery in Donetsk. Today was the first day, probably this year, that the Ukrainian army hasn't been able to shell Donetsk, the city of Donetsk, and kill civilians like they've been happily to do for so long. Interestingly enough, we've had the Zelensky Fun Fest, where he showed up to the Congress of the United States dressed like the manager of a bad strip club, wearing a t-shirt and Chinese communist knockoff tactical pants to beg for more money. Yes, begging for money, begging for tax dollars. Yes, sir. And I guarantee you, the big guy will be getting his cut over the 100 and some billion that we have managed to piss down the Ukrainian shithole. And while you can hear the Ukrainian fanboys seizing up as I speak, the only thing that our money has bought is Ukrainian coffins. Because the money that we are sending is emboldening people to resist. And we sent a bunch of javelins that Ukrainian soldiers carried into battle who would not use because they had never been shown how to use them. They weren't trained, they weren't confident. We have made the Ukrainian army think they can resist the onslaught. They keep drafting younger and younger folks. They're now bullying 13 and 16-year-olds to go out and fight. Old men are being forced into the line. And to what end? To be a mound of dirt that somebody will place a Ukrainian flag and dump a bunch of flowers on if they're lucky. Most of those guys are not going to be returned, repatriated, or even buried. What else has our money bought? Well, it's bought dead civilians. Because a lot of the weapon systems that we have sent, the M777s, the HIMARS, have been used to attack the city of Donetsk. Now you may be saying, well, Dave, Russia. Okay, Russia. What about Russia? What about Russia? What about Russia? Well, you know, the favorite argument. Russia invaded a sovereign country. The sovereign borders of Ukraine were violated. Okay, cool. Dig it, man. Dig it. Absolutely. And I'm getting so tired of that trope, but the only way you can fight that is with a little bit of common sense. Now, I remember, as well as many of you folks remember, and it's a recurring theme with me, that we threatened nuclear war over security concerns over a little island called Cuba. So we pretty much already set the standard that it's okay to go to extremes if you believe your sovereignty, your ability to survive is threatened. We've already proved that. And if you really wanted it proved by today's standards, then really all the Russians would have to do is set up a couple of military bases in Mexico, maybe a couple chemical research labs like they had in Ukraine, and see how long that goes on. See how long people would be okay with that. The same people that are crying about the sovereignty of the Ukraine, the purity of their borders, I guarantee you wouldn't have 2 minutes problem violating the sovereignty of Mexico and violating their borders. I, for one, wouldn't have a problem with that. I wouldn't have a problem with that at all. I don't necessarily think that living with a threat on my doorstep is a good, productive way to live and does not ensure security for the future generations of my countrymen. So maybe, if you can put it in those kind of terms, you would be able to see how the Russians may feel justified in entering Ukraine and removing threats to their sovereignty, removing threats to their security, and preserving the Russian-speaking minority of Ukraine. I mean, we actually preserved the Muslims in Bosnia and in Kosovo, the Kosovar Albanians. Does anybody remember that? Oh, I remember that. We bombed the living shit out of Serbia over it. And it's still paying dividends. If you haven't been paying attention to what's going on in Serbia, it's still paying dividends. Yes, there are problems in Serbia. The Serbs in Kosovo have gotten a little pissed off at the overreaches of the so-called Kosovar police, and they've started erecting barricades, and there has been a flurry of shitstorm messages between the West and Serbia. And the West is doing its best to strong arm and twist the arms of the Serbs to fall in line and do what the West thinks is best. When you get right down to it, I think that Serbia needs to decide what the best is for Serbia. It's amazing that a lot of folks, like myself, don't believe that the government should be in our business daily. We don't want the government in the business of average American people every single day. Yet, those same folks don't have a problem with our government being the nanny for the rest of the world. Telling the rest of the world, you have to do this, you have to do that, you have to do the other, you have to be that. This is something that's relatively new. We haven't had this arrogance, this overconfidence, this overabundance of arrogance that we are the end-all be-all savior of the world and you will do what I say. This bullshit didn't come about until the end of the Second World War. And maybe not even then when you really want to get down to it, because there was a multipolar world after World War II. There were 2 big boys on the block. There was the Soviet bloc, and there was the Western world, NATO bloc, Warsaw Pact versus whatever. And you still had these little individual offshoots. You had the Chinese communists and their whole deal, and they were kind of sort of aligned, but not always, with the Soviets. Their relationship was tenuous at times. But generally, there were 2 big kids, and there was a balance. absolutely a balance of what was going on in the world. And after 91, we became unipolar. One pole. It's the West. And of course, the big boy on the West was us. And apparently, since 91, we have just been walking all over the place, slapping everybody in the face. And to what means? To what means? If we really are this great, powerful nation, why is our standard of living not the best in the world? I mean, it's pretty high. I'll give you that. I've been to enough places that are not particularly nice places. I've dined with people in what's basically a mud hut. I've been to cabins with dirt floors in various places. Hung out with people. Don't judge everybody by that. Everybody has different amounts of means. But if we are the end-all be-all, why do we have people living in squalor in Appalachia? Why do we have people living in squalor in inner cities? Why do we have any homelessness in this country at all if our standard of living is so great? Now, don't get me wrong. I don't believe that we should be giving money out all over the place and willy-nilly. But I will tell you this. I would be much better if we took the $100 billion that we were pissing down the Ukrainian shit show and we gave it to education of children. Or every school in this country gets free school lunch. Or building low-income housing and taking and finding a way to police and bring up the standards in the low-income housing that we already have. And don't get me wrong, I don't want to make a society where everybody is going to be in government housing. I believe if you can pay your way, you should pay your way. But before we make Ukrainian oligarchs rich, before we give more money for the big guy, before we pay tens of billions of dollars to put young Ukrainian kids in a hole in the ground, shouldn't we be doing something for the enrichment of this country? This country. Last I heard, we have a debt, a national debt. $100 billion to Ukraine doesn't satisfy that debt. And my question is, we're having trouble to figure out how we're going to fund the government. You know, we had to have this big omnibus funding bill. If we're really having all that difficulty, then where the hell's the $100 billion coming that we're pissing away? I got news for you, folks. There are things that you ain't never seen yet on the horizon. I hear in January, there's going to be a massive peace protest in D.C. And of course, it's interesting. You're not going to see any Democrats there. No, the Democrats are all in on this. You will see the far left fringe of their party. You also see libertarians, and you're going to start seeing more and more conservative-minded folks realizing that our founders did not want us entangled all over the globe. That for some reason, our founders didn't want us being an empire and not having imperial aspirations. But yet, as you see, we are, for all intents and purposes, the new USSR. We are the new Soviet Union. We have our satellite countries. And they all bow and scrape to us. And they do our will. And we flex our muscle. And we buy other people off with money. Comintern, which of course was Comintern, for those of you who understand what that was basically the communist answer to the Marshall Plan. It wasn't nearly as well thought out or regulated as the Marshall Plan, and in the end it was more of a type of bribery than it was a hand up or a lift up. And that's what we're engaging in nowadays. And it's sad. It's sad. We just passed the 32nd anniversary of the fall of communism. And I'm not going to lie, I realize I have friends and people who watch this in the former Soviet republics. I have friends that live in the United States that still have a soft spot in their heart for the Soviet Union and communism. I don't at all. For me, that was one of the greatest moments of my life. It opened up the world. Unfortunately, in the end, we took advantage of that. Instead of bringing together a world where there wouldn't be all this nonsense, where there wouldn't be a constant fight, we just had to give organizations like NATO had to adapt. They had to find a new reason to exist, a new reason to suckle at the teat of the United States and get money. And I'll tell you what, you couldn't get away from that region. So they had to decide that the new Russia was something to be feared. And Putin had to be the new boogeyman. It couldn't have been Yeltsin. Yeltsin was too complacent. Yeltsin was a transitory figure. He and Gorbachev are both transitory figures. And of course, during any time of transition, you're going to have a lot of corruption. You're going to have a lot of problems. You're going to have a lot of chaos. And the years of Gorbachev and Yeltsin are all marked with chaos. And not to mention that both folks were, in my estimation, very weak leaders. But when you got a leader who wanted to see his country excel, you saw a leader that wanted to return a little bit of prestige to his country, then suddenly the West starts pissing their pants. And I don't know, guys. Putin is that guy. Putin is the guy that has everybody pissing their pants. And I don't think the West has thought about it. In fact, I'm going to put out a video a little later about how the West hasn't thought this whole Putin thing out yet. But anyhow, that's me in a nutshell. That's what I've been up to. That's kind of what's going on. Stopped. Took a little time to grow a little grub on my face to cut the cold wind off me. We've actually had a brutal week or so, or a few days, where the temperature just got nasty, and we're down into the zero a couple of times, and single digits. And for those of you who are watching in Europe, zero, I'm not talking zero like zero. I'm talking zero like which would be a -16 for your temperature. So anyhow, folks, that's what we got. I'll talk to you later. Bye.